Today, we're diving headfirst into manipulation and mind control, not in theory, but in practice, and through a real-world case that is unfolding right now, the second Karen Reed murder trial, and more specifically, the testimony of the now infamous Jennifer McCabe. This case is a goldmine for the kind of analysis I find interesting. First, there are allegations of government collusion, specifically involving members of the Canton Police Department. And second, we're watching a battle over perception, over the truth and reality. You know I'm all about peeling back the layers, exposing the tactics, and helping you think freely. And today, I'm not doing it alone. Joining me is Sergio Dinaro, a deception detection expert with over 20 years of experience in federal safety, security, and intelligence operations. Sergio has already published an in-depth video analyzing McCabe's Day 7 testimony prior to the lunch break. And if you haven't seen it yet, put it on your watch list because it truly is a masterclass. But here, we're gonna go a little deeper. We're breaking down how deception detection actually works, what signals Sergio sees in McCabe's testimony, and in true Carolyn fashion, I will be pushing back on some of his conclusions because I am a natural skeptic. Then we will finish by answering some questions his viewers asked him in the comments while watching his video. So let's get into it. The first part of the Day 7 testimony is pretty basic. Attorney Jackson asked us a lot of questions that honestly everyone already knows. And so my question is, why would an attorney ask a subject questions that they already know and everyone already knows the answer to?
Carolyn, that's a great question. Now, I don't specifically know that they do it in the trial for this reason, but I know in polygraph and in interrogations, any type of law enforcement interview, the beginning questions are meant to create a baseline. And the point is that the subject knows that the interrogator knows the answer to these questions. And then the subject has the chance to answer these questions honestly. And that gives the interrogator a chance to read the subject's body language, their verbal mannerisms, specific words that they use when they're being honest and truthful, and specifically how much information they give to an honest answer. That's how we establish that baseline.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so they're essentially just trying to, as you said, they're setting up a baseline so they can compare deception or potential deception in the future to this kind of baseline. So they know when somebody might be just trying to deceive them or lying because they're going to act differently or answer in a different way, correct?
Yes, exactly. When you're reaching into your memory to answer something like these easy questions, you show certain body language. But when you're accessing a different part of your brain, when you're trying to fabricate, that generates stress and that causes different speech patterns. And then you can compare those.
Okay, great. I just wanted to get that settled at the outset because that is really important to understand when you're trying to figure out if someone's deceiving you or not, because you need to know how they act normally. Whenever I've watched interrogations, trials, stuff like that, I'm always like, why are they asking such basic questions? Like, we already know the answer to it, but it's actually very important. And it's like step one to deception analysis. With that kind of out of the way, we're going to get in a little deeper here. This next portion of the testimony drew a lot of attention. We're looking at when a separate law enforcement agency contacted McCabe. They first talked to her outside her house, and she alleged that she didn't know who they were and lied about living at the house. She essentially said, I thought they were just trying to sell me something. As a result, and then shortly after, they called her, informed her who they were. She then requested 10 minutes to get ready, essentially, and then an interview commenced inside her home. Here's Attorney Jackson's question and her answer. I'm going to play the clip.
You ultimately did allow them into your home, and you did sit down for a formal interview with them, correct?
Yes, brief, but yes.
You highlighted in your video that she unnecessarily mentioned that it was brief. And this is especially odd because you said this in your video, but the baseline is her just yes or no answer. She doesn't really add anything in the beginning or anything at the end. And so my question here is, how do you know that this is deception exactly?
Yeah, great question. So one of the indicators that I look for, it's called out of sequence information, or information that seems like it doesn't belong to the listener. In this case, she says the word brief, but the question itself doesn't mention anything about time or the length of time there. Let's say, for example, you're in college, you take a test, and you cheat on that test. You end up getting a really good grade. You leave the class and your professor calls you and says, hey, I need to talk to you in my office. Now that stress is going to be ramped up. You don't know what it's about, but because you cheated on that test, you have a strong suspicion that that's what it's going to be about. So you go, you meet with your professor, you walk in there, and when they start talking about the test and you say, yeah, that was a really easy test, wasn't it? They haven't asked you any questions, but that guilty conscience is going to add extra information out there that is weighing on your mind because you're very stressed about the guilt of cheating on that test. You feel like you need to say something that's going to build up your answer later of why you did so well on that test. And so you're going to throw something out there like, oh, yeah, that was a really easy test, completely unprompted. That is a classic indicator of deception. In this case, it's not deception in and of itself, but it's out of sequence information. It's information that's inserted that's going to be referenced later to insert false or deceptive information. In this case, the word brief means I'm looking for her later to try and squeeze out information, to push it out, to say that the interview was too brief, we didn't talk about that, or something like that, to that effect.
So she's essentially like setting the stage for future questions, and she knows that this is a touchy subject, and so she's wanting to set it up so that anyone listening, specifically the jurors, are going to just already assume that it was brief and it's not that big of a deal. So when the attorney asks about it, it's just brief. She has nothing to say. That's essentially kind of what she's doing.
Yeah, it's pre-programming. And if you know how to use this effectively as an interrogator, it can actually be very effective because most people don't realize that. So if you're not trained in deception detection and you don't realize that, that person pre-programs your mind to make you accept what they say later when you hear something that reinforces something that you heard before.
And people do this subconsciously, I'm guessing, because, I mean, or is Jennifer McCabe smart enough, a genius enough to be like, okay, I'm going to plan this right here. And I'm going to actually follow that up with kind of a longer question. So you can just respond in full later. But I guess where I'm pushing back here is if the prosecution knows that the defense is going to zero in on this conversation, whether it's proving that Jennifer McCabe is lying or involved in some kind of collusion or not, the prosecution, couldn't they have coached her to emphasize that it was brief just to frame it in a way that supports their narrative? It's essentially, I'm saying, yeah, they're doing what you're saying they're doing. And you did say that does not necessarily mean she's being deceptive, but does it necessarily mean that she's trying to hide something actually negative or bad, or simply trying to guess the defense's future argument, which we kind of already know what's going to be because there's already been a first trial, and any good attorney is going to try and guess what the defense is doing, and set it up to weaken the defense's argument, whether the defense's argument is actually correct or not.
Let's take that in a couple parts here.
Yeah.
You can definitely manipulate a conversation purposefully, but I would say that that is much easier done as the interrogator when you're planning out what needs to be said and you're the one that says it. It's much easier to follow through on that. When you're trying to coach someone else to do that, it can be very difficult. They would basically have to be a professional actor who memorizes all of their lines, and that's very difficult on the stand, because you don't know how the questions are going to come or how exactly they're going to be phrased. So the part that I want to emphasize is that the reason why this comes across so easily here is because that is something that's already weighing on her mind. The question, I guess, is it possible that this was all pre-planned, not that it's weighing on her mind? But even if it's pre-planned, that doesn't mean that it's truthful. So whether you pre-plan it or whether it's weighing on your mind going in there, it's both leading up to later removing a piece of information. So if the defense is doing that, it seems very dishonest. There could be...
You mean the prosecution? If the prosecution...
Sorry, yes. If the prosecution is purposefully coaching her to say brief now so that later on she can omit information in order to be deceptive about it, that's possible, but it seems highly unlikely, and a big part of what I do is following the most likely answers here.
I guess when it comes to the ethics of this, and of course I'm going to bring it up, yes, it can be deceptive. I agree with you. And maybe they're setting the stage for something that is deceptive. or trying to omit certain information or just make it seem less of a big deal. But if it's not that big of a deal to begin with, and you know the defense is going to make it a big deal, wouldn't it make just logical sense to try and make it not a big deal because you're trying to counter the defense? And why I'm bringing this up is I'm a lawyer. We haven't really talked about that. I'm not a trial attorney, but lawyers coach their clients all the time on what to do in the courtroom. And this has been talked about. They talk about this in law school, if it's ethical or not. For example, if you have a client, and let's say your client normally wears a wife beater, baggy jeans, and a huge beard that's unkept or whatever, you're going to tell him, hey, when you go into court, wear a suit and shave, get your hair done, whatever. And that's because they're trying to make it so that the judge and the jurors see that individual in a different way. Is that deceptive? Yeah, it is deceptive. But is it necessarily wrong to try and frame something or someone in a way? Like, let's say in that situation, the person was totally innocent. Well, of course, you're going to want to make it look like that individual is innocent because he actually is innocent. And even if he wasn't innocent, you still want to give your individual or your client the best representation possible. They're owed that under the Constitution. I'm going on a little spiel here, but how are we to determine the kind of deception that is being used in a situation like this?
Sure. Okay. So yeah, that's great clarification there. Everything that I do, it starts with a baseline, but it ends with deception or non-deception. Like you mentioned before, this wasn't actually deceptive in and of itself. So this was merely something that I noted that's called, again, out of sequence information. So this part, again, it's not deceptive, but what I'm looking for is I'm noticing that this is a common pattern. When extra information, even truthful information, is added in, and it doesn't matter why it's added in. It could be the prosecution may have coached her to give a certain image or a certain look, but the deception comes later. Everything here on out of sequence information has two parts to it. So this is simply something that I noted. The reason why it's there doesn't really matter. What it's going to cause me to do is heavily scrutinize later if she is omitting information regarding that interview. Very specifically, I'm going to be looking for the word brief, because if she used the word brief now when it's out of sequence, I'm looking for her to use it again later that will reference directly back to this. It's a clue. It's not an indicator of deception. What it is it's a clue for me to look at this as a potential pattern that I'm going to see later.
Yeah, okay. And that makes sense. Essentially what you're getting at is you have the baseline. And then as you are reviewing the testimony and the conversation, the interrogation, whatever it is, you are building a foundation to do a more holistic analysis of the entire conversation or all the questions. And so you just take note of this now, and then you further read it later. And brief was mentioned later, so we know that then it was something that we should take note of, and it's not irrelevant. And then you're able to go back and analyze that and compare the two. And so I think that's really important for people to understand when it comes to deception analysis, is that it is not you're not just taking individual lines as they are, you are doing a holistic analysis. And you've mentioned this to me, you read these things like 5 times over because you're doing a whole comparison. And so thank you for explaining that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I'll just sum it up again by saying that's the reason why we do the baseline so carefully, because this was a deviation from the baseline. So I just noted that. And then later, if in another deviation, she's talking about this interview and you see that connection back to the word brief, then everything ties together.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. So let's move on to another common analysis that you made throughout the testimony. You continually point out that sometimes her answer comes at the end of an explanation. And you say that that is a lie. It is deception in the situation. And so I'm going to give you an example of when Attorney Jackson is asking McCabe about the separate law enforcement agency talking to McCabe outside her house. So he says, okay, quoting him, "At this point, they had not identified themselves." She then says, "They didn't know." You point out that this is a lie for the reason I just mentioned. But I guess my question is, why is that a lie? I mean, she's just repeating exactly what Attorney Jackson said. One could say she's simply agreeing with him. And I've seen her do this elsewhere. So what's the deal here?
How do you feel about playing a little game with me first?
Sounds good. Let's do it.
How about if I ask you some questions? Okay, if anything makes
Okay.
you super...
I'm not stressed at all. Okay.
Now, I'll have to preface this by saying that if anything makes you uncomfortable, just don't answer it.
Okay. I'll say, talk to my attorney. No.
So, yeah, exactly. And answer these like you would if you were on the stand. So don't over-explain, don't under-explain. And even though we're playing a game, just try and interact like you normally would, I guess. So,
Okay.
so do you have a car?
Yes.
Do you have a cat?
Yes.
Do you love your cat?
Yes.
Do you love your job?
Yes.
Is your channel based upon intellectual integrity?
Yes.
Okay. Are you an honest person?
Yes. Why did you laugh?
Because I was trying to create a situation here that's going to make you stop and think.
Okay, so my questions essentially are like, when you're asking me questions, they're very basic. Do you have a car? Do you have a cat? Do you love your cat? Whatever, do you love your job? It's just yes, no, yes, no. But when you're in a courtroom setting and you are looking at someone who you know is your adversary, the opposition, and they are trying to get you to mess up, and they're trying to get you to elaborate or stumble your words or whatever. So honestly, exactly what's happening right now can happen where people are like, I don't think that person is telling the truth. Like, that adds a level of anxiety and stress. And also you have to take into consideration the person's personality. I'm a bit more of a confrontational person. I'm very direct. So if I had an attorney sitting across from me and they were, asking leading questions that were kind of insinuating that I did something bad, I might clap back a little bit. So I guess my question is, how do you tell the difference between somebody who's like, being deceptive, or maybe they're just kind of pissed off?
Okay. Yeah. To answer the question about saying yes or no, basically answering the question directly in the beginning versus at the end. When someone answers a question, especially when you're in court or in an environment where there's a lot of stress, and that's another thing, is the answer to the question has to truly matter. There has to be consequences for the answer. So when I ask you, do you have a car? You answer yes, because there's nothing in your mind that is conflicting about that answer. So you're being asked a direct question, even if you're being attacked, even if you're a witness and the defense attorney is attacking you, you still have no reason to not answer the question directly. In fact, it's quite the opposite. No matter how confrontational you get, you might increase the amount of anger or aggressiveness, but that answer is still going to come right at you right in the beginning. Like I could say, do you have a car? And you'd be like, yes, I have a car. But you're still going to get that answer right away. So if I put you in a situation where you have to lie, then that answer doesn't come direct to you. If I'm talking to a random person and saying, did you cheat on your significant other last night? There's going to be a period of time where your brain has to switch from the memory that it's pulling of last night to saying something that's not that memory. The first thing that you do as you start to fabricate is you start to create reasons or explanations. And that comes across as the first thing that you say. Normally, when I ask somebody, are you an honest person? They're going to say, well, usually, or they don't answer the question immediately because honest is a vague term. Can you lie sometimes and still be considered to be an honest person? When you ask that question, the person is going to have to think, okay, well, I know I've lied before. So am I an honest person? And they're going to start their answer with an explanation. The big difficulty in deception detection is if there's no consequences for your answer, then those indicators fall off.
Okay, so essentially, because like when you asked me that, I didn't run through my mind if I'm actually, like, I think I'm generally an honest person. Have I lied? For sure. But I guess if I'm on the stand, I would automatically think of times that I may have lied or whatever, because honesty, while you're on the stand in a court setting, or if you're being interrogated and you might be, implicated in something or accused of something, suddenly your brain is going to flash to those things a little faster. Whereas for me, I'm just hanging out here and I'm like, yeah, generally I'm an honest person. So yes, that's some good analysis. That makes sense.
Yeah, and this happens a lot throughout the statement, and you'll see what I'm talking about over time. The rules that people use when they're constructing their sentences and they're turning their thoughts into words, that is a pattern that is consistent forever throughout their entire statement. So if you do something one time, you're going to be doing it over and over again. And so that's what I look for, is those patterns.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you for explaining that.
Actually, you want to try a different exercise?
Sure.
Okay, I'm going to give you words and you turn those words into a sentence.
Okay.
So we'll start with the word truck. I'm going to give you words and you're going to basically make a sentence that's longer and longer, adding those words. So the first word is old. You don't have to create a sentence, just use those two words.
Oh, old trucks.
Okay, so you noticed you put old before the word truck.
Yes.
Okay, so now add the word American.
Old American trucks.
Yep, old American trucks. Now add the word big to that sentence.
Big old American trucks.
Now, this is the last one. I know gets hard to remember, but the last one is red.
Big red old American trucks.
I gave you a bunch of adjectives, and even though I gave you the adjectives one by one, you were actually maneuvering them, putting some in front of the others.
Mm-hmm.
There are rules about the order in which adjectives go. And I bet there's not a person in America who can explain to you where age goes, where color goes, where material type goes, as far as which comes first and which comes second. However, we all know those rules. We use those rules because those rules are embedded into that Broca section of our brain. The prefrontal cortex doesn't know those rules.
Yeah.
So we can't explain them, we can't define them, but we all use them. Mm-hmm. And that's the same principle as putting the answer to the question in the beginning of your answer as opposed to putting it at the end of your answer. Because if you're answering the question truthfully, then you're going to answer it directly. I asked you, do you have a car? And you said yes. If you wanted to lie to me about that, you would probably say something along the lines of, I got my driver's license when I was 16. I've always had a car since then. Something like that would tell me that you don't have a car right now because you didn't answer the question in the beginning of the answer.
Mm-hmm. And that's what you're saying.
It's just a structural violation that you may not know that rule in the front of your head, but you know the rule back here. And if you're not using it, then I can identify that.
That makes sense. So essentially, I first want to say I think I said the order incorrect, but
you did actually. But there's a lot of words in there, so
I switched old and red incorrectly. But I realized after I said it, I was like, I'm not even going to go back on that one.
But it sounded wrong.
Yeah, no, I noticed it immediately after I said it, but I was like, I'm gonna commit at this point.
Yeah.
But yeah, so yeah, it is natural. So essentially, what you're saying is when somebody is being deceptive, they have to consciously almost like go around what they naturally want to do? Or are you saying that because they're being deceptive, it's a natural inclination to do it that way because of the Broca?
Yeah, your brain has a process. Everyone has a certain way that they like to do things. Your brain has a way that it likes to do things. When it's looking at a memory and assigning words to that memory, it does it in a certain way. But when you engage a different part of your brain, in the middle of the Broca section trying to assign words, it breaks up that sequence. And it causes your Broca section to reroute that word formation, and it causes you to violate those rules of just honest, direct, straightforward answers. Okay, that's great. That's very interesting and good to know. So thank you for explaining that. Like kind of the psychology and science and anatomy behind that is very helpful when it comes to understanding this. So thank you. Okay, so now we'll move to the next one. So this part isn't really me pushing back on you. It's actually something that I thought was suspicious, and I wanted to get your opinion on it. So McCabe does not tell the law enforcement agency who she is when they first talk to her outside of her home. She says, I thought they were like selling something. So I was like, oh no, I'm not the homeowner. I'm honestly genuinely confused as to how this conversation even occurred. She then walked into her home and she just
the home that she allegedly did not own. I mean, maybe she was trying to show that she was a friend or something, or like just visiting, and somehow the agency didn't introduce themselves or explain why they were there. If they're there for an interview, this wasn't some undercover operation. And so since it wasn't undercover, why would they even try and hide their true intent? That, coupled with the fact that they then called her, she requested 10 minutes to herself prior to the interview. She then placed 5 different phone calls, and she later didn't fully tell them about it. It's all just a very odd situation. So I want to know what your thoughts are on this, because you do point out that this indicates sensitivity, but that you aren't sure if she's embarrassed about it or just lying. But given the context of the situation, could it be anything but lying, honestly?
No, it can't be anything but lying. But so this is where I work very diligently to maintain intellectual integrity in the deception detection that I'm doing. There are areas where it's clear, like, you know that they're lying, but if I don't have indicators that support it, I'm not going to pretend like there's indicators there that support it. Now, there are times when I'll speculate or tell you I think this is what happened in my videos, but I'll say that's based on my experience. So this is a great example. I worked for the Department of Homeland Security, not FBI, but I was a federal agent before this. And when a federal agent approaches somebody, generally speaking, they're going to walk up, probably have their credentials in their hand. This is how I used to do it. I had my credentials in my hand, and then I would ask that person their name before I introduce myself. It's sort of an aggressive mentality that law enforcement has, where it seems more socially polite to walk up and say, "Hi, my name's Sergio. I'm a federal agent. What's your name?" That's sort of like how you introduce yourself at a cocktail party. But federal agents don't do that. They'll walk up to you, or police officers will walk up to you and say, "Are you Jen McCabe?" before they introduce themselves. Most likely. I'm not saying based on indicators or whatever, but based on my personal experience, they probably had their credentials in their hand. So that's why you see all the deception here, is that she knew that they were federal law enforcement, but technically the first thing that they said most likely was, "Are you Jen McCabe?" So she knew they were law enforcement, and she lied to them and said, "No, I'm Nicole. I'm Jen's sister." And then she turned and walked inside the house. So that's most likely how that played out.
Yeah, because I was trying to recreate it in my head, and I don't have the experience you have as an occupation, so I didn't know how they would approach her exactly. But there's no way that in the first sentence of their conversation, they didn't say what they were. They weren't just like, "Hey, I have Girl Scout cookies to sell." Like, you know, I mean, like, it's just, what do you mean? It's a sales agent, or someone trying to sell something. So yeah, I wanted to get your perspective on that with your background and kind of your experience. And obviously we know this is just speculation, but it's a suspicious situation given all the other indicators that are kind of surrounding it. And what, honestly, Attorney Jackson is pressing on, which is the 10-minute break and the 5 calls in between, and then lying to the independent agency about that. Yeah, I just kind of want to talk about it. It's kind of crazy to me.
Yeah, obviously it's clear that she's being deceptive right out the gate, and that she knew who they were because she flipped around the answer to the question.
Okay.
So you can tell that she is being deceptive. Now, I can't for sure say exactly how they approached her, but like I said, my guess is she knew who they were. They walked out with their credentials probably still in their hand, said, "Are you Jen McCabe?" And she took that opportunity to shut that down and lie and get out of there.
Yeah, that would make sense. Okay, we're going to move on to when the defense was grilling her about calling Carrie Roberts during the 10-minute interview between the law enforcement agency calling her and then her doing the interview. Okay, so I'm going to play a clip, and here it is.
You wanted to let Ms. Roberts know that you had been contacted by certain officers from a different agency, correct?
I was curious if they had already been to her.
Okay. Yeah, that's rough. Okay. But here, specifically in your video, you mentioned that there was a change of pronoun from she to they is an indicator of deception. And so I'm asking, why is that an indicator of deception? That's kind of random. Maybe she just made a mistake. How can you tell the difference between deception and someone just making a mistake, maybe because they're, on the stand and they're stressed out and whatever?
So pronouns, I love pronouns because pronouns are objective. Let me give you a simpler example with the pronouns. If you're talking to your significant other and you tell your significant other that you went out by yourself last night, you went to the movies, and then we went to dinner, and then I came home. There's no possible way that there wasn't two people who went to dinner, because the we slipped in there. Pronouns objectively tell you the truth. When you see a change of pronoun, like in that example, it's even worse when somebody says I went to dinner. So that's what we're looking for. And I chose that statement because it's a very good example of how and why the change of pronoun happens. You saw her say, so I was curious if she talked to them, is what she was going to say. But the question dealt with her talking to them. Did they meet, or did she want to talk to them? She couldn't say that. So she had to cut herself off. And then she started it again. And she says, I was curious if she, and then the next thing that she would have to say is talked to them again, because she literally said the exact same thing that she said the first time, which wasn't going to work. So she switched from she to they. She says, I was curious if they met with her, because the only way in her mind that she could switch from talking to meeting was to switch from she to they.
Yep. Okay.
And so
that's a great breakdown.
Now, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, my God, that's a lot of information to try to process when you're listening to somebody, it is a lot of information, but I just look for the change of pronoun. If you're listening to somebody in real time, then just listen for a change of pronoun, and that will tell you what you need to know. You can go back later like I just did and dissect the sentences and figure out what she was going to say if she continued talking in the first two times that she tried to say the sentence. But the change of pronoun gives you the indicator of deception that you need in order to see that in real time and say, okay, she's lying.
Yeah, and I think also, when you have experience with deception detection and you know the case, totally know the case. So like, let's say you're the attorney in this situation, or you're interrogating someone in a different situation, you pick up on that a little easier because you know what they might already be trying to hide. Similar to like if I was talking to my significant other and he goes, it's like, I don't need to even think really to notice that and know exactly what that means, right? And that's because I know him, I know the situation, and I know what he might be trying to hide. And so in this situation, like maybe somebody who is not very trained on it or does not know the case fully may not catch it right away. But I'm guessing with experience and knowledge, it gets a lot easier to pick up on that in the moment instead of having to analyze it at a later time.
Yeah, exactly. Just like you said, when a significant other does it, you catch it immediately. It doesn't matter how much training you have.
Yeah,
As an interrogator, it's the same way. If you're trained in this stuff as an interrogator, which unfortunately most interrogators aren't, but if you are, you'll pick up on this stuff right away.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, so we're going to stay on this topic. And now Attorney Jackson is really trying to figure out why McCabe called Roberts. Okay, and I'm going to read what he says and we're going to talk about it. He says, and you also wanted to find out what she told them, if she had been contacted by them, correct? That was your motive in calling her. And she says, no. Now, she's previously shown, according to your assessment, that her one-word answers are the baseline of truth. Well, here we have a one-word answer. It's just a no. It's her baseline. In the video, you say this is a lie. You make this determination based on future analysis of the testimony, but you also say that her saying no is sometimes deceptive and sometimes not. So my main question is, how in the world do you tell the difference between a lying no and a baseline no when you're analyzing this? And then I have another question I'll follow up on.
Okay, so let's try me asking you questions again one more time.
Right, I love this. This is not stressful at all.
This one's much easier. So
you have a deception detection expert essentially interrogating you on camera right now on YouTube. This is great, but sure, continue.
No, in this example, what I want you to do is I want you to lie. Okay. So and try and make this feel as real as possible.
Yeah, okay. I'm not an actor, but I'll try.
So be honest with the first question. Do you have a cat?
Yes.
Now, lie to me on the second question.
Okay.
Do you love your cat?
No, he sucks. Sorry. I mean, okay. Actually, go back. Ask me again. I'm gonna try and get in the head. I'm sorry.
No. Actually, you answered it exactly how you should have.
Oh, really? Okay. Because like my brain was kind of like, I thought of all the things I didn't like about him, like litter. I hate litter. So I almost started talking about how much I hate litter, but then I stopped. I don't know what that would have meant if I did.
Yeah. So when I asked you, do you have a cat? You said yes, because you're agreeing with me and you don't need to explain yourself when you agree with me. Just a one word answer is sufficient. So when I asked you, do you love your cat? And you had to say no, but you immediately said he sucks. Like, obviously it was hard to think of a reason why, but when you leave a no hanging out there, when you're disagreeing with somebody, it's an awkward pause there. When you disagree with somebody, you have to give them a reason why you're disagreeing with them. So when you're on the stand and somebody says, did you call that person? And you say no, everybody's waiting for, I didn't call them first, whatever. There's going to be some sort of an explanation. Now, that being said, some people are very terse and they don't care about that awkward silence. And so that's why baselining is important. What I want to emphasize here is that yes and no are very different. It's much more socially acceptable to give a one-word answer of yes than it is to give a one-word answer of no. So most of the time, honest people will say just yes when they're answering yes, and they'll say, no, he sucks when they're saying no. They'll have a little bit of explanation after that.
And the reason being is because, and this is a little bit me just speculating, but it's because they are disagreeing with the initial statement. And so they feel the inherent need to essentially explain why they disagree. Whereas a yes, it's already an agreement. There's no reason to add any additional information.
Yeah. Some people will just cut it off at no, but that's why you have to baseline this. So I think this is the first time she said no. So what I do is I mark this. And then later on in the statement, if there's an area where we know that it's called a known lie, where we know that she's lying, and she says no with no further explanation, that becomes a pattern. Now I know when I go back, she always says no and cuts herself off because it's a lie and she doesn't want to explain.
Okay. Yeah, that's too hard. That's hard to do, to explain a lie, right? You're creating an entire fabricated reality, essentially.
Yep.
So it's just back to the holistic analysis kind of thing. In your first review, you mark this. You later found that she, when she's lying, and you knew she was lying, she would say no just directly. And so you're like, okay, that means that sometimes no directly is a lie. And then you saw in other instances where she was telling the truth and she explained a little bit. Is that kind of how you compare that?
Yeah, but I also found a known lie in here where she says no, and that's it. She cuts herself off, but it's a known lie because she ends up right after that. He asks her the same question again, and she says yes.
Yeah, yes. Okay. So my next question is, it seems that it's obvious this was her motive to call Roberts, honestly. Like, why else would you call? Like, does it really matter if the agency had been to her house before? There's literally no additional information there that would actually help you. So seems pretty obvious that she was trying to get a little more information. But that's an assumption, okay? And so is there a risk in this assumption? If you could possibly come to a conclusion or an assumption, is there ever a time where that is actually a part of the analysis in deceptiveness? Or do you have to essentially remove an assumption or any conclusion you come to prior to the analysis? Like, is there a middle ground? Is it sometimes you can use it, sometimes you can't? What's going on there?
So to clarify, you're talking about when am I comfortable putting my assumptions into my analysis?
Yes, exactly. Like in this situation, it seems pretty dang obvious that that was her motive, right? But it is still an assumption. So my question is there ever a situation where an assumption is okay to include in your analysis, or do you have to exclude all assumptions?
The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look for questions later that address the same topic and see if we can get more information. If we can't, if there's just, and there is a part in here where there's one question, it's short, and I can't, in my mind, it's clearly deceptive, but there's no definitive indicators there, then I will just note that and say that this, I can't tell one way or another. And that raises actually another really good point, which is that a deceptive statement screams deception. If somebody's lying, there's going to be hundreds of indicators of deception throughout their statement. And that's really, really important to keep in mind, because this isn't an excuse to make mistakes. But if there is a mistake somewhere in there, if there's an assumption that gets put in there that ends up being incorrect, it's not going to change the outcome because it's one of 100 indicators within the statement. I try not to fall down that slippery slope of especially getting towards the end of the statement where there's been 500 indicators of deception up to this point. You have a very clear idea of exactly what's going on, and then you start making assumptions. I try not to do that. And now I will speculate, and then I'll say, this is Sergio's speculation here in my videos. And I'll start to put the story together based on what I think is the most likely course of action that the person took. But I try to make that clear when I'm speculating versus when I have proof that something happened.
So is there ever a situation from a professional standpoint where that speculation is helpful, though?
Yeah. So if you're an interrogator and you're in the interrogation booth and you're not on a witness stand, then speculating is great because you just find an area of sensitivity or an area of deception in the person's statement, and then you just go back and ask them questions on it. You can speculate all day long in an interrogation. If you're using deception detection in real time, then you can speculate all day long. Just make sure that you continue to ask good questions and that you don't fall in love with your own analysis.
Yeah. Okay. Sounds good. That makes sense. So another question. A few times you mentioned eye shielding as a sign of deception. And so my question is, why is shielding a signal for deception? Because honestly, sometimes I close my eyes when trying to, remember an event, or if I'm thinking really hard, honestly. So how do you determine the difference between that?
So there's a lot of reasons why somebody will close their eyes, but I'll give you the big three here. So what you mentioned was you'll close your eyes when you're thinking. And the big difference there is that you're not talking while you're thinking. So if I ask you, what did you get for your mom for her birthday 2 years ago? You might look back and you might, look up to the left, and you might actually close your eyes for a second and try and remember, but you're not talking while you're doing that. Now, if you are talking when you close your eyes, there's two big reasons why people will do that. One is for a point of emphasis, and the other is called eye shielding. So eye shielding is a protective measure. You've probably heard, like, when people get stressed, you see their body language. People will fold their arms, which is a defensive posture. They're protecting their organs. Human beings have certain things that they do that are protective measures, and eye shielding is one of them. So if somebody is giving a point of emphasis, they might say, that person was lying right there. And they'll blink and close their eyes as a point of emphasis. But if somebody leaves their eyes closed for a fraction of a second afterwards, let's see if I can do this. You just got all blurry, but hopefully you can see my eyes. If somebody says, I went and I got in the car, and they keep their eyes closed during that really important, controversial part of what they're saying, then that is shielding. It's a protective measure. It's sort of like when sharks attack, they close their eyes. It's the length of time, and it's specifically the word that they're saying when their eyes are closed, and they keep their eyes closed for the whole word. Like micro expressions, it's very fast, and you have to know what you're looking for to be able to differentiate somebody making a point, somebody blinking just because they're blinking, or somebody saying a word that's deceptive and they're keeping their eyes closed.
Okay. So at this point, we already know Attorney Jackson's general angle. We know the prosecution's angle, not only because of how the trial is going, but because there was a whole other trial already. Here's something that I've been wondering, and it's kind of similar to a question that I already asked you, but this question keeps coming up. And here it is anyways. How do we know deception that is hiding the actual crime that occurred, or the potential crime that occurred, or someone's involvement in it, versus actions that may seem deceptive but are either normal responses or a typical litigation strategy? And I'm going to give you an example, and we're going to watch it.
You wanted to find out if she had talked to these particular law enforcement officers and what she had told them, so that your story could somehow align, or it could inform how you responded to questions that they asked you. Isn't that true?
That's not true. We both know what happened. We don't have to have a story. There is no story. There's what happened, and that's it.
Okay, so here's the thing. We know Attorney Jackson is trying to argue that there is a story, that they have colluded, that they are colluding. And you say in your video that she is attacking the question, which is a deception tactic. And so I have 3 questions, and I'll just ask them back to back, and then we can dive into each one. First, what is attacking the question? Second, why is it deceptive, and is it ever not deceptive? And 3, bringing this back to the case. If his accusation is false, let's enter the world real quick where it is false. How is she supposed to rebut this obvious allegation? What would a truthful person say in this situation?
Okay, so we'll address the first question first. What is attacking the question? So the problem with the way that he asked the question here is that the question itself is a statement. And then there's a question at the end. And the question at the end is, isn't that true? And she turns around and instead of addressing the statement, which is the meat and potatoes of the question there, she takes the opportunity to address only the 2 words at the end. Is that true? And then she says, that's not true. She attacks the question part of that statement. And that is an indicator for her specifically. If he says, blah, 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 correct, and she says, incorrect, that is a deception tag for her. She only uses that when she's lying. And that rule, that pattern translates to this. That's called attacking the question, where you make a definitive statement against the only question part. The problem is when you ask a question where most of it is a statement and then just the question comes just a little blurb at the end, it's much easier to lie. So it's easier to attack that last bit and say incorrect, or I think she says that's not true, which is an uncontracted denial instead of that isn't true. But that's what attacking the question means. It means that they're doing something other than addressing the actual question, which in this case was a statement. Okay.
And then the second question is it ever not deceptive? You said for her specifically, it is a deception tag. So I'm guessing that means that's not always deceptive.
Generally speaking, if you don't answer what's being asked of you directly in the beginning, it's deceptive. There's a lot of different types of deception. There's omission, there's lying, there's exaggerating, but the only truthful response is going to come directly at the beginning. So to answer your question here, if somebody's attacking the question, that's not the way that you would truthfully address that question. Instead of saying yes or no, she chose to attack the way the question was asked. She's not lying about the question. She's on a mission to attack the way the question was asked.
Okay. It's or kind of like avoiding having to lie, like an easy kind of cop out. So she's avoiding having to lie because that's harder to do. That's harder to make your mind do. And I guess it's just kind of a defensive, kind of protective mechanism then that people do automatically if they're trying to avoid a question or, deceive.
Exactly. There's a whole slew of defensive mechanisms that people use.
So then kind of a follow-up question on it. I'm thinking of attacks as like kind of adversarial, right? And the judge points out that, McCabe is answering in kind. And this is a legitimate objection. It's when a question is argumentative rather than seeking new information. And Attorney Jackson does cross this line, or at least dances along it throughout the entire testimony. And so the judge sees the answer as in kind, and you say it's deception. And so I'm saying, can someone not be frustrated by the continual badgering of the same point? Because Attorney Jackson is kind of drilling in on the same point and asking the same question over and over again. So no new information is really being provided from McCabe's perspective. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's definitely acceptable to get angry, to get frustrated. Emotion is not an indicator of deception unless it's right in the beginning. There's certain emotions that I'll look for when you make that confrontation question, but it's going to be related just to the one question. Now, in this, where you're in the middle of interviewing the witness on the witness stand, you can definitely ask the same question over and over again, and that person can get frustrated or angry, but that changes their tone, their linguistics. It might change their body language, but it's not going to change the way they structure the answer to the question. If I ask you, do you love your cat? And then you say yes. And I say, are you sure you love your cat? And you say yes. And I say, I've seen you yell at your cat. I'm not 100% sure you really love your cat. And you might say, I do love my cat. You might get aggressive, but it's not going to change that you still answer the question directly.
Okay. I see what you're saying.
So it doesn't
Yeah,
change
you're
the
right.
verbiage. It just changes the emotion behind it.
Okay, yeah. I was answering in my head, so that makes sense to me. You were correct. That is how I would answer it. So I think that's a great point. Okay. So I wanted to point out something that I found interesting about this testimony. It's not really a question, but I wanted, honestly, the audience to look at it, and I wanted to get your opinion and hear your thoughts. Right after the question that we just now discussed, Attorney Jackson then asked another question, and I kind of want to talk about it. So I'm going to play it, and we'll analyze it.
So if that's true, Ms. McCabe, you'd have no reason to call Carrie and ask her if she had been contacted by these law enforcement agents, because it's just the truth, correct?
We're going through this whole experience together. We call each other about everything.
There would
That's
be no
nothing
reason,
more than that.
So
I'm sorry.
Let her finish her answer. Go ahead, Ms. McCabe, you can finish that.
There's nothing more than me calling and saying, hey, did they come to your house? That's what we did when the media showed up, when Miss Reed's private investigator showed up. We just give each other the heads up, hey, somebody's coming. Because we're just like normal moms. We're not used to this.
Okay. Okay,
Wow,
so first I want to
so
say,
many indicators in there.
No. I actually just noticed this. I've watched this so many times, but I just noticed this. When she leans forward and talks, her tone is very interesting. It's almost like a little aggressive. There's something about that tone when she first starts talking that I'm like, I kind of like was like, ooh, like, I don't know. There's something about that. But anyways, the first thing I want to say is that Attorney Jackson, his question here is great. He makes a great point, and it like really puts her on the spot. So just kudos to him for that. McCabe allegedly called Roberts to ask if the law enforcement agency had been at Roberts' house previously. McCabe starts her response to this question by saying, hey, did they come to your house? But here's where there's like a weird switch up. She ends her response with saying, we just give each other the heads up. Hey, somebody's coming. That's different than asking if somebody had previously been there. She's now saying, you're giving someone a heads up. That would be if Roberts had called McCabe and warned her the agents were coming by, not if McCabe called Roberts to ask if the agents had already been by. It wasn't just like, had they already been there? It's like, this is a heads up situation. And that giving someone a heads up, in my opinion, is way more believable and normal than just being like, hey, like, have they been there? Who wouldn't want to know if a law enforcement agency is going to stop by and interview you, or the media, or private investigators? Yeah, I just don't think people would call someone and say, hey, has someone already been there? Like, that just doesn't, that's not the natural inclination of human action or human mind.
Right.
And so I thought this like weird switch up was very interesting, and I think kind of seemed like she let some stuff spill that she was not intending, but she was stumbling because Attorney Jackson asked a tough question, put her on the spot, and we got some spillage.
Yep. So what happened there is not something that I usually call an indicator. She has a way of trying to rephrase the question that she's asked, and then she answers a different question. So she sort of takes the question, rewords the question into something else that's easier for her to answer, and then she answers her own question. So that's not uncommon. That's a deception indicator. In this particular case, what you pointed out is just a logical inconsistency. She got lost in her own story, which is really funny because that is typical Jen McCabe. She gets if you let her talk, she gets lost very quickly. And I understand Attorney Jackson wants to cut her off, not let her ramble. But if this was an interrogation, I would say let her ramble, because she gives a bunch of not just indicators, but logical inconsistencies. As the interrogator, it's hard to say, look, you showed this indicator of deception here. And people are like, what's an indicator of deception? But when you say, hey, you said you called to get a heads up, like that doesn't even make any sense.
Yeah, it doesn't.
Yeah, it's easier to point out. Yeah,
I have been hoping that Attorney Jackson, lets her ramble a little bit more, because I'm like, the stuff comes out when she starts rambling. But yeah, I understand he wants to get going, keep going, whatever. But I'm like, the jury's listening. They might pick up on some of these inconsistencies, and that's a huge one in my opinion that we need to talk about. But yeah, I just want to hear your opinion on that. And then this is just honestly another compliment for the attorney of the defense, because I love how when they're discussing who McCabe called during the 10-minute interview, that she continues to refuse to admit that she lied to the agents, and he just goes, "It's not a lie. Is that some shade of a lie that I'm not aware of?" Like, the sass in that. Attorney or trial attorneys are performing on a stage essentially, and so I just think he did a great job, and I kind of laughed, and I just want to point that out because I think honestly everyone kind of was like, "Dang," on that one.
He is my favorite attorney that I've seen so far doing all of my analysis. The way he asks questions and that sort of sassy follow-up is hilarious. I love that. If I ever get in trouble and you're not going to be the one there to defend me, it's going to be him.
Yeah. I honestly support that. He has a lot more experience than me. But I do like how he essentially lays it out to the jurors and to, honestly, the whole audience, because we know this is national television at this point, and just lays it out, adds a little spice to it, and then just it's like a dropped bomb. And everyone's just kind of like, damn.
Yeah.
Okay.